right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Why don't you come up sometime, see me?
Rated bar! Top of the world!
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
The stuff that dreams are made of.
Hi, Wendy here. Before we start off our episode today, I want to remind everybody to check us out on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. Also, please leave a rating or comment on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. You can find us on social media by simply searching Silver Screen Time Machine, and please make sure you follow our podcast, Silver Screen Time Machine, anywhere you get your podcast. Thank you, and enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome again to Silver Screen Time Machine, Wendy's Classic Film Review. Today we have a guest, Ed. Hello, Ed. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Ed, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I am involved in a lot of the local film and theater scene in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I help run a nonprofit group called Stage Warp Productions. We're out of Carnegie, PA. And I'm also on the board of McKeesport Little Theater, which is in McKeesport. Like many actors, I'm involved in many different theater groups as well, and I just started last year to dabble in film. I've been a lifelong film fan, and I competed in the 48-hour film competition last year, which was awesome. As I've started to get more into film, I've started to study film more as an art form and started to really see the deeper side of how film works.
Yeah, so obviously you are good to talk about film here with us today, and you did choose this film. So we are getting in our time machine, and we are going back to 1958, and we are going to talk about...
A Touch of Evil.
Touch of Evil. This is an Orson Welles film, which is always exciting to have an Orson Welles film. A little bit about this film. This film was actually based on a novel called Badge of Evil by Whit Masterson. And it says that Whit Masterson is the pen name for two writers named Robert Wade and H. Bill Miller, who had met at the age of 12 at violin lessons. And they would go on to write novels together until Miller's death unfortunately, at the age of 41. They said they wrote about 30 novels together.
It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, so I think this is loosely based.
I would agree with that because anything that's Orson Welles is always loosely based.
It's got the Orson Welles.
Yeah, because he liked to say, well, it's my idea, but then there was also the novel, so it's almost like the novel became an outline for his plot.
Right, exactly. And actually, Orson Welles said he did not read the novel at the time of writing the screenplay. He had never read it. So it would be hard to base.
Yeah, I know he didn't really like the title either. So that makes sense.
Yeah, so what happened, this is a very strange production from the very beginning to the very end. It's very oddly set up.
Absolutely.
So what originally happened was a fellow named Edward Mull, I'm not really sure how you say his name. Anyhow, he was the head of Universal International. He purchased the film rights to this Badge of Evil, and he hired a fellow named Albert Zug Smith, who was known as the King of the Bees, or the King of the Bee movies, not bumblebees. He hired him to produce this film. Zug Smith would assign a television writer named Paul Monash to write the script, and he wrote the script adaptation within 4 weeks. But Zug Smith read the script, and he didn't care for it, so he sort of halted production and said, let's just put this aside. Whatever. It was kind of forgotten for a moment. But then in 1957, Orson Welles had starred in an Albert Zug Smith film called Man in the Shadow, and on the last day of shooting, Zug Smith said that Welles was interested in directing a picture for him. And Zug Smith handed Welles a whole pile of scripts and said, go ahead, pick one. And Welles said, give me your worst script in the bunch. And Zug Smith handed him the Badge of Evil Menashe's script. And he looked at it and he said, can I have 2 weeks to write it? And Zug Smith said, sure, you can have it. And in the meantime, what also had happened was they had sort of started casting for this because they had sent the script to Charlton Heston. Mm-hmm. He had just kind of come off of his big epic films like The Ten Commandments. He was a very popular actor at this time. And he asked who was going to direct this film. And they said, well, they didn't know because it was in, limbo. But they had told him, we have hired Orson Welles to play Quinlan. And supposedly Charlton Heston said, well, why don't you just have Orson direct? He's a pretty good director. And eventually, after they conferred for a while, they did ask Orson Welles to direct. And Charlton Heston said that Orson wrote the script in 10 days.
Yeah, it's the whole thing is just impressive because it's just like Orson Welles basically just saying, I accept this challenge.
Yeah.
And it's also just so funny that Charlton Heston just said, oh, you guys need a director. Well,
yeah, hello.
You literally have one. He's pretty good. And the way that he said the story, and Orson Welles said the story, is it's almost like the production staff hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah.
Which to me is so mind-blowing because, yes, Orson Welles is a fantastic performer.
Right.
But I think, in pop culture, if you would just think Orson Welles, you think director.
Right.
And that there was a time in the 50s where they didn't even consider him is mind-boggling.
I think they are a little afraid. I feel like production companies were a little afraid of him far as his all of innovations. He was going to take a long time in post-production, not necessarily production. He was actually pretty quick about shooting.
Yeah.
It was the post-production, the editing that usually took a while. And also he was kind of unreliable. He would just up and off somewhere else.
He had so many unfinished projects
Yeah.
at that time. And actually, at the time, he was, technically speaking, ostracized from Hollywood. It wasn't
Yeah.
like he was blacklisted, but for the reasons, you just said, people kind of thought he was a drama queen, fly-by-night guy.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to deal with that.
Yeah, they didn't find him reliable,
No.
certainly. But it's 10 days to write a script.
Amazing.
Think about it.
Yeah, and also he only had about like $1 million budget.
He didn't have a bad budget.
It wasn't a lot.
$800,000, I
Okay.
think it was.
So
which,
at the time-
doesn't sound like much nowadays.
No, but
back
back
then,
then-
and this was not this wasn't going to
No.
require a lot of fancy sets or anything.
No, because this was technically a B movie, like you said. That's why there was some,
the producer, the King of the Bees.
King of the Bees was involved. Yeah, that is also something very impressive about this movie is that it still stands as a great film, but is actually technically a B film.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And then, okay, let's continue on, though, about for the production crew. The music, which it's odd to me because there's a lot of music that is just sound in the film. You'll hear music by the store shops as they're going by, different music there. You'll hear ambient sounds or whatever, like dogs barking, people yelling, sirens. There's a lot of sirens in this film. But there's not a lot of score, but yet the score was actually done by a really great composer, Henry Mancini, who is a Pittsburgh boy.
Yep.
So it's like, why are you wasting the great Henry Mancini and not putting more score in?
So odd. I was shocked to find out that Henry Mancini actually did the score. And then ultimately the edit that Orson Welles wanted, like you said, had just the sort of natural background noise, which I think that works. But again, Henry Mancini is fantastic.
Yeah, a lot of times they use that player piano. That's very prevalent in the film. That comes up numerous times. It's very relevant there's some symbolism in there. But you do hear Henry Mancini, if you're paying attention and you're listening, a lot of scenes where people are chasing or fighting, you'll hear that sort of brass, frantic music that Henry Mancini is so very good at. And it works really, really well. It gives you that sort of dark, pursued feeling. This whole film is quite dark. The majority of this film was shot at night.
Yeah, it's true.
Because Orson didn't want the studio spies hanging about, and they would obviously hang about in the daytime. And so he would try to sneak around and shoot most of his film at night so they weren't watching him.
Yeah, in fact, the opening scene, which is possibly the most well-known part of the whole movie, they just filmed it all in like one night.
Yeah.
And I found it interesting. I didn't notice it until I watched an interview with Charlton Heston. He said if you look very closely, you can actually see on the horizon the sun is starting to rise because they cut it that close for that reason.
Yeah. And I guess since we're talking about shooting the film, let's talk about the cinematographer, Russell Meddy. Really, really beautiful job. He's an expert at black and white, to be honest, which is very funny because he won his one Academy Award for color for Spartacus.
Oh, really?
But yet I feel that he's so great at black and white. We actually just talked about him in a recent podcast. He did The Misfits. We had The Misfits, and his cinematography was so beautiful on that. He has this great ability to show these beautiful landscape views, and he does this in here. You don't think, oh my gosh, Touch of Evil, there's a lot of beautiful landscape views, but there are places places, like when she goes out to that weird hotel,
ranch
and there's
type
these
area.
gorgeous vista views in black and white, and they're so beautiful. He was also a long-term collaborator with Douglas Sirk. He did like 13 films with him.
Wow.
And he had this black and white contrast he was able to do, creating effects with black and white contrast while shooting twilight and night. And that's what we're talking about, not only in this film, but he also did The Stranger with Orson Welles
another
as
great
well.
film.
And also, a lot of these scenes are done on crane shots. And he did a really good job, especially that first scene, like you talked about. Clearly, you can tell it's on a crane, but there's so much camera movement throughout everything in this film.
Absolutely beautiful. And I thought, just talking about the angles that he used from the crane, like high points to even just low points, it was absolutely amazing. And even though there are sometimes quick switches where it's like,
there was a lot of that. Yeah,
it was like you don't even notice it until you take a step back. You're like, whoa, you're so immersed in the scene. And another thing that I found interesting is regarding his low angles. That was also sort of symbolic.
That's an Orson Welles trademark,
exactly. And in this case, he tried to show that there are crooked people in the world by literally portraying some of the characters on crooked angles on screen, which I thought is just absolutely brilliant. Talk about, subliminal cinematography.
Yeah, and that's very German expressionist too, shooting at an angle, distorting things, but also the low angles on Orson Welles to make him look ginormous, like this ginormous monster. He looks huge in this film.
Yeah.
And not all of that was Orson Welles.
No.
A lot of people are like, oh, Orson Welles is so chubby,
He's a big guy, but no.
No, he's not that big. They actually had his makeup artist, Maurice Siderman, who worked with him in Citizen Kane and did all that great makeup in Citizen Kane to age them. He's the one that did all the makeup on Orson Welles here, and they said they put like 30 pounds of prosthetics on him. So I know Orson Welles was a little chubby at the end of his life, but they still had 30 pounds of prosthetics. And that nose, obviously not his real nose. And he just looks like a monster.
Yeah.
He looks monstrous.
He really does. And there's the funny story too regarding that makeup is that it took so long to put on and take off that one time he had to leave set to attend a party, and he arrived at the party he's just like, you know what, I'm just gonna wear my makeup and I'll just explain when I get there. And before he could explain, he had some old friends walk up to him and say, Orson, how are you? You look great. And he's just like, well, yeah, I feel great. What?
The fakeness of Hollywood.
Yeah, and he loved telling that story as a little jab towards, the Hollywood elite.
Yep, exactly. That's exactly what they would do too. And again, these Orson Welles trademark, these low angles, the deep focus. He's still doing the deep focus in this. We've talked about deep focus in many, many podcasts here, especially the last one, The Rules of the Game. And again, like I said, that panning crane camera, the camera movement is so incredible. And then let's flip over to the editing, this is again going to be very confusing because this film went through so many editors. So what happened, unfortunately, was Wells started doing the editing with Edward Curtis. Same name as you.
I was going to say, his great first name at least.
Good first name, yeah. So they originally paired him with this fellow, and they were starting to put together a rough cut, but they had creative differences. Because, I think we know that Orson was very particular about the way his films were done, which, of course, I can imagine why. And so they replaced him with Virgil Vogel. And at the end of this, Welles did get a rough cut done of the film. But then, as typical Orson Welles, he ran off to start shooting Don Quixote, just left this rough cut at the film. And Universal was kind of like, hey, where's the film? What's going on? So unfortunately, this very reminiscent of what happens with the Magnificent Ambersons, they hired another editor named Aaron Stell and said, take over and cut the film. And this guy had no idea what Orson's plan was. He was just working from scratch, and they wanted it more conventional editing, which, why? Why would you do that in an Orson Welles film? That's the beauty of Orson Welles, is it's not conventional.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so unfortunately. And then on top of that, to add insult to injury, they had Harry Keller come in and direct some extra scenes because they're like, this film makes no sense. And they're like, put some more scenes in so the film makes sense. So then eventually, when Orson Welles came back and saw this film, he was, of course, unhappy. And he wrote supposedly a 58-page memo detailing all his suggestions for change, which 58 pages had to be quite a lot.
It's a lot, yeah.
Actually, you can see the memo yourself if you want to sift through all the 58 pages. If you get the Warner Brothers restoration of
That's
Touch of
really
Evil.
cool.
Yeah, it's one of the extras.
Yeah, because I feel like comparatively, that would be probably at least half the size of the script itself.
Yeah.
Would roughly.
They
yeah.
had cut it down to something very low, like 85 minutes or something. It was not, They had cut it quite down. Actually, they thought this memo was lost, but it was found in the possession of Charlton Heston. I don't know when. But then what happened was they wanted to do a restoration of the film, or they wanted to re-release the film. And they took all of his memos and they went through the film and they put in the edits that he suggested. And then they released it again in 1998. So the person that did the editing for that was Walter Murch. So he did Walter Murch in the 1998 restoration, went through Orson's memo and made all the edits he suggested when he could. I mean, there was a couple stuff he couldn't do, but it got the film back up to, I think, 108 minutes or whatever the film is currently at. But I thought that was really great.
Oh, yeah. I
that
mean,
they did that.
It's when you watch that's, if I would recommend a version to watch, I would say watch the, you know, 90s.
I think that is the main version.
It is, because it should be the definitive version, because that's the way Orson Welles intended it to be.
Right.
And it's great.
And the editing is really important, I feel like, because the editing, there is so many transitions back and forth, just between close-ups of people, between scenes. Throughout the film, he's going back and forth from one scene to another scene. One scene to another scene. So there's a lot of quick cutting in there. So the editing is super important. So I can see why he was frustrated.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you also have to take into account, he literally started the movie out with a bang.
Yeah.
You know, there's an explosion in the first few minutes. That's how you kind of are introduced to the characters. And that just set the pace for the entire film. But like you said, with the editing they made, it sounded like the pace was completely thrown off.
Yeah.
And you just, that can wreck a whole movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this is a very fast-paced film. Even I said there's a frantic music with Henry Mancini. Quick cutting really creates a sense of tension. And throughout this film, you have a very strong sense of tension and suspense. A funny thing I read was that Orson Welles stated that his goal with the film was to infuriate the audience with the plot in much the same way Howard Hawks did with The Big Sleep.
Oh.
So he wanted to confuse the audience. But it said it became even more confusing once the studio recut the picture. So this did not do well at the box office. It bombed terribly. They didn't even want to release it in Europe, but they wound up doing it anyway, where it did quite well. But in America, this did very poorly, and it's probably because they were doing the edited Orson Welles edited version.
I think Orson called it like a chop job or something like that.
Well, that's what they always did.
I was going to say that he's referred to that with many of his films.
Yeah, The Magnificent Ambersons is a great example. So now let's start getting a little bit into it. We're going to talk about that opening scene. Do you know that they, in the studio version, they put credits over that opening scene?
I did not.
Can you believe?
Yeah, I did not know that
Why?
until recently when I was rewatching the movie. And I thought, that's just ridiculous.
Awful.
I can't believe they would do that. Because one of the beautiful things about that opening scene is you could watch it probably 10 times and see something
else,
different.
right.
Because there is just so much going on in the first 3.5 minutes of that movie. And if you have these credits, you're going to miss all of that.
Yeah, and it said the opening scene was one of the earliest tracking shots and the longest at that time of 3.5 minutes. And you just see it. And it's cool the way the camera pans in and out. It goes over, it goes down.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really beautifully done.
It's literally a like bird's eye view, or kind of a almost godlike perspective, because you're being introduced to the characters.
Yeah.
And you know that there's a bomb. The audience knows that there's a bomb and it's going to go off potentially.
Yeah, that's the first thing you see is somebody they're holding a bomb.
But nobody else knows that that's what's about to happen. So we get this interesting perspective that we're just watching and waiting. And just to throw in credits, that's not the time to do it.
No, that would have been awful. I'm so glad that they fixed that in the other one. I should mention this film is shot on real locations. There is a small part that was shot in a set. It's the Mexican shoe store. It's the Mexican shoe store clerk's apartment. I don't even know what part that is.
Yeah, it was. So that was the wife. She like went away after Charlton Heston's character sent her away, and she ended up running into that gentleman, and then she had that whole little discussion where,
with Uncle Joe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was a set, but apparently everything else was not a set, and it was filmed in a real city. It was actually not even filmed in Mexico, but it was filmed in Venice, California, because Orson Welles couldn't get Tijuana, which is where he wanted to shoot it. A couple other notes before we get into this too much. I thought it was interesting. Janet Leigh broke her left arm before filming commenced. So she did the entire film with a broken arm.
Wow.
And if you go back and watch, they kind of hide her arm most of the time, but in revealing motel scenes, they'd remove the cast for filming and then reapply it. So she had to do that every time she had one of those scenes where she's in her little lingerie, or she has a lot of scenes like that.
It's dedication right there.
Yeah. And actually, Charlton Heston's character was not supposed to be Mexican. He was originally supposed to be white. His wife was supposed to be Mexican, and Orson is the one that switched it. And I just find it really hard to deal with Charlton Heston in this sort of brown face, not Mexican, no accent, like not even attempt at the accent.
Nothing. I mean, I love him as an actor. He is so phenomenal, and he has such great range. And it's like, this is not in your range. This is outside.
And I would say Charlton Heston is so good in movies such as The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur and these big epics. It's really good for his theatrical style of acting and his posing and his face angles that he's always making. But this, I don't think this is the vehicle for Charlton Heston. This is something that requires more subtlety.
I'd agree, because like when I think of him, I think of action's hero, Charlton Heston. Like I love, Planet of the Apes and Omega Man. That's what I'm thinking of.
He's very good at that sort of posy, and theatrical, big acting.
Absolutely. And those are, he's just the story for both of those. And this, he was interacting with Orson Welles and, Janet Leigh. And
it just seems...
Yeah, it
seems miscast, to
I
be
agree.
honest.
I would argue he did a good job with it, but it is also miscast as well.
Who?
He is just miscast,
And, I mean, I hate to say this too, but I think Janet Leigh is miscast. I don't like her in this film either. I don't dislike her, but I just... This weird character she plays. I don't understand her character at all. Her character makes no sense to me.
Yeah, it's almost... I think... It's kind of, I have like a neutral take on her in the sense that she's a great actress as well. But you're right, like the character is...
Yeah, it's odd.
It's weird. It's almost like, is she meant to just be kind of annoying? Is she meant to be the damsel in distress? Because those are the vibes
She sort of goes between like this ingenue, wide-eyed ingenue to this bitchy character.
Yeah,
and it's like, what is happening? Who is this person? Like, you don't even get a sense of her, to be honest.
No, you don't. She's just kind of there, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's really odd. So anyhow, let's start out a little bit. Where we start out with the big shot. We start out actually with somebody holding a bomb, and then we see a person putting this, what we believe to be the bomb in this person's car, and then we have that tracking shot where we see the car driving along, and then we now run into our characters, Susan and Mike Vargas and Susan Vargas. That's Janet Leigh and Charlton Heston. And I guess back in the day, you could just basically walk up to the border and be like, "Hi, we're going across the border."
That's what it seemed like. No, and they were just like, okay, well,
no fanfare.
Why are you doing that? Oh, we want to go get a chocolate soda. Sounds great. Okay.
And then the guy in the car is like, "Can you please let us through?" And they're like, "Oh, okay."
And what was really weird too is there were two streets around this little checkpoint, and it looked like you could just very easily just walk past if they were busy.
Yeah, the checkpoint was like a podium.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in the middle of like a 3-lane highway, and it's like, what is this?
It was so strange. It's like right in the middle of the town. It was very odd. But the fellow in the car and the girl in the car, and very significant. The girl keeps telling the customs officer, "I hear a ticking. I hear a ticking in my head," and they pay no attention to her. Because, if you hear a ticking and you're at a border patrol, just no need to worry.
They're just like, oh, she's the drunk mistress.
She's just a loony stripper.
Yeah, whatever.
We don't care about her.
They're always hearing those ticking noises.
So they get over the border and then you hear this huge noise because, you're focused on Mike and Susan. They're having a tender moment, kissing, and then boom, this huge noise. You see this explosion. At all times, Mike just doesn't really concern himself with what's happening to Susan. He just runs off to do his job, even though he's not technically, this isn't even his jurisdiction.
Not jurisdiction, no.
He's just like, explosion, I must go. You just stand over there.
Which is an interesting...
Go by yourself.
It's like an interesting character arc of his, because on the one hand, it's like, oh, he's selfless and noble, like he wants to go help people. And on the other hand,
he abandons his wife.
He just literally
at every turn.
His new wife. Like they mentioned that we just got married. Yeah, it's like a honeymoon. And he's just like, see ya, babe.
Yeah. He just says, bye, I'm going to go check this out. And so what happens is he goes over to find out what's going on. He runs into these American, because this happened on the American side of the border. So he runs into these American people investigating. They have actually Joseph Cotton plays the coroner, which if you don't pay attention, you can miss him. And they said that Orson Welles actually dubbed Joseph Cotton's lines, which I wondered why, but... Yeah. It said that he dubbed all Joseph Cotton's lines, but he plays the coroner. That's a little bit later, though, because they haven't come to the coroner. But what happens is, as he's going to investigate this explosion, this weird sort of thug, this young Mexican thug, comes up to Susan and is like, come on, come with me. And of course she goes, sure, why not?
Yeah.
I'll just go with this random stranger.
I'm on the border.
Looks a little threatening.
There was just an explosion. My husband just left. Sure, random guy.
Go ahead. And I just thought that was so strange. Like, why would you go with him?
Yeah, she didn't understand stranger danger. Clearly.
Yeah, I just found it very, very strange. So she does go with him. And this is when they'll do this cutting back and forth. They're cutting to Susan's scene. They're cutting back to the investigating the car explosion, etc. And Vargas talking to the other officers about what happened. The DA arrives, Adair. DA Adair is played by a fellow named Ray Collins, who is a frequent Orson Welles actor. Orson Welles loves this guy. As a matter of fact, Orson Welles called him the best actor he had ever worked with.
Wow.
He was from the Mercury Theater with him. He was in Citizen Kane. He was in The Magnificent Ambersons. But he was mostly known for playing Lieutenant Tragg on Perry Mason.
Oh, that's cool.
This Ray Collins.
Wow.
But so he plays this district attorney, Adair, who is not a great character. He's kind of smarmy. I don't like him. He's very much in league with Quinlan whenever Quinlan comes along. So we first see him, and then we see the assistant district attorney, who turns out to be a pretty decent guy. And he is played by Mort Mills is the actor. His character name is Al Schwartz. Mort Mills was a Marine parachuter in World War II. He played the cop in Psycho.
Oh,
the one that makes her nervous and keeps hanging about and bothering her. He had a long career in TV, generally in Westerns. And here is another fellow that I have had this on the last 4 podcasts. Somebody in the cast dying because they fell asleep with a cigarette in their bed and being burnt to death. But except they found out, that's what they thought happened to him, but what they found out is that he actually had a heart attack before he burnt up.
Oh, man.
Because I guess he had a heart attack while he was in bed and he had a lit cigarette, and apparently he died before he was burnt to death. But that's happened to several cast members in like the last 3 episodes. I just find that very odd that keeps happening.
That is so weird, yeah.
But anyhow, so this fellow, Al Schwartz, he's the assistant district attorney. He's a good guy. He's more of an honest fellow. He's more like, let's get to the bottom of things, whereas Adair's like, I don't want to be bothered. You just, just make it look good. So, stuff like that. And then what they do is they get the daughter to come out to identify the body. The daughter is named Marcy Lineker, and she comes and identifies the body. That's her father. We find that her father is this sort of, I guess, wealthy fellow. And then who arrives on the scene but Quinlan.
With a nice dramatic entrance, he gets out of the cop car, and it's almost like he parts the Red Sea. All eyes are on him,
Hank Quinlan. Well, because he's so monstrous and big, too.
You literally can't miss him.
Yeah. And Orson Welles, not only did he have all this makeup on, but this way he's speaking, he affects this very strange voice that is not Orson Welles' regular voice. And I just think it adds so much to the character. I've never thought Orson Welles was the greatest of actors. I think he's a good actor, yes. But in this, I thought he was so fantastic in this role, playing this just despicable, gross individual.
You're right, about his voice. To me, it's kind of gargly.
Yes.
It's almost like he's got marbles in his mouth.
Like he
did
the Marlon Brando with the cotton in his mouth.
Exactly. They're calling like that. Yeah.
I'll make you an offer that you can.
Yeah. And I guess, again, that's probably a layer to why, he's disgusting. He's like, you don't even like to hear this guy speak.
No, he's sort of like,
yeah.
And he's always going, making these strange, sort of noises, and he's smoking the cigar, and he just looks so gruesome. And he's accompanied by his partner, who is Pete Menzies. And Pete Menzies was played by a fellow named Joseph Kalila. This fellow was in Gilda. He was in After the Thin Man, My Little Chickadee. He had a lot of bit parts. This guy was actually from Malta. He played a lot of Hispanic characters, but he was from the island of Malta, which is an island between Italy and Africa. And he started out as a singing performer before turning into a stage actor. And as I said, he had a lot of really bit parts throughout the years in films, but I thought he was one of the best actors in this film.
Yeah.
Pete Menzies, the partner, because he really goes through a lot of, he's not very big, huge role, but he goes through quite a lot of emotional stuff throughout the film.
Yeah, and he's also, you kind of think a good guy, but he's also, very loyal to his partner.
And I feel like he's kind of, in a way, brainwashed by Quinlan. He just wants to believe him, and maybe he's not paying attention. At first you get the impression that he's a little bit silly.
Yeah.
Silly and not really with it.
Yeah, almost dumb
like
in
a
a
dupe.
way.
He's almost
he's
like Orson Welles' dupe, or Quinlan's dupe. And I think that's why Quinlan can get away with as much as he's getting away with, but as we find out. But you're still sort of in the first set of scenes, and you've been basically introduced to every character in the film, pretty much. Because as all this is going on, it's going to flash back to Susan, and they're going to show that this Poncho, this weird Mexican thug, has taken her to this place. I guess this is the shoe store you're saying?
Yes, yeah. That's that scene.
And she's suddenly introduced to this character named Uncle Joe Grandy. And what we find out is that Grandy is this sort of Mexican, maybe like cartel type people or drug type people that Vargas, her husband, is putting the kibosh on, and he's cleaning them up. Apparently they're holding the brother of the Uncle Joe. So this Uncle Joe Grande is trying to, obviously, he wants to get Vargas. So and again, Susan is acting so strangely. She's faced with she's all by herself in the store with these two sort of threatening characters, and now she finds out at least one of them is related to the people that her husband has prosecuted. And instead of acting afraid or anything, she's yelling at them.
Yeah, she basically says, shame on you for supporting your brother when my husband is going after him. And you're like, what? And it's kind of funny because the characters themselves reacted that way. Like the audience, they were like, what?
You're like, why are you?
They're like, you're not afraid?
Yeah, they're expecting her to be terrified. And she's just pretty much like, oh, how dare you? What are you doing?
I'm on my honeymoon, I think she says. Like, what?
It's like she's so naive that she doesn't understand she's in danger or something, which is why I call her an ingenue, I guess. So, I guess a little bit about the fellow that plays Uncle Joe Grande, we should say. Akim, I think his name is Akim Tamirov. He's of Armenian descent. He was basically lived in the Russian area at the time. I think it's actually Georgia now. But at the age of 19, he joined the Moscow Art Theater School and studied under the great Stanislavski.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he actually had personal experience studying under him. And he was Oscar nominated for The General Dies at Dawn and For Whom the Bell Tolls. He was a pretty great character actor in a lot of films. Like I said, we're cutting back and forth here. So now we have pretty much met every main character in the film. What happens is that Susan just walks off and leaves and goes back to, I guess she's going back towards the hotel, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's what the end goal was.
Yeah, and Quinlan and Vargas they're still out there talking about this explosion and so forth. And there's something interesting in this film that I noticed numerous places, that they have Vargas or somebody stand by these signs that say certain things. Now, they have this shot of him standing by the sign that says, "Welcome, stranger," like a big poster. I think it's supposed to be introducing coming into the country or whatever, the city. But it says, "Welcome, stranger," right beside his head. So I'm always wondering what they mean by these sort of things.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that.
Yeah, so eventually what they decide to do, the investigators, is they decide to go to the strip club to find out they find out that the girl in the car has apparently been picked up at the strip club, so they decide they're going to go to the strip club to see if they can find some information about this girl, whatever. But as they're doing this, there's a lot of these sort of delinquent, thuggy kids.
Yeah.
And this one calls Vargas. He comes out and he tries to throw acid on his face, but luckily he misses, because why would we want to ruin Charlton Heston's face even?
Yeah, that's probably
even
what stopped
in brown
him.
face.
Yeah, he's just like, this guy's too
So
handsome. I can't do this.
Look at him posing there.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
handsome.
he was just standing there.
His little angled head
Yeah,
poses.
he's like, oh my gosh, that profile.
He does like to show his profile.
Yeah, there's just
He's
a
always
lot.
like,
There's always just these profiles.
yes, yeah, and he does it so sharply. Like,
Yeah,
this-
it's funny because it's like you're not even facing anybody right now.
he does love his profile. He's sort of Yul Brynner-like in that way, always posing. So when they go to the strip club, who is the owner of the strip club but Zsa Zsa Gabor? So you have a little cameo from just a very small cameo from Zsa Zsa Gabor. And they basically don't find anything out there. I think that scene was to show Zsa Zsa Gabor.
It probably was.
I'm not
or
really
like
sure.
they just were like, let's just, you know what? We're on the border. There has to be a strip club.
club,
So
yeah.
something goofy. It really did nothing for the plot.
They do come back to the strip club later on, but then as they're walking out, Quinlan gets all distracted because he hears this player piano. And then we get introduced to Tanya, who is played by Marlene Dietrich. And to me, I'm not a big fan of, I feel the leads are a little miscast in this film, but I think Marlene Dietrich is so compelling, so good.
Just mystifying, even just with the shots with like her eyes.
Oh, she's
It's
just
like
amazing.
hypnotic.
Yeah, she's hypnotic is a really good word. I thought that myself when I was
Yeah.
thinking of her. Do you know that she was I think she was 56 when this was shot?
That's amazing.
She looks absolutely beautiful.
oh gosh, like 20 years younger than that.
And
least 36.
the reason she's even in this film is because while they were shooting, Orson Welles called her up out of the blue and said, "Hey, I kind of would like you to be in my film. Could you come down and shoot tomorrow?" She called her the one night
Yeah.
and asked her, could she come down and shoot the next day? And apparently she found a fellow she knew that knew a lot about costumes or something. And they rustled through some costumes. She got her wig and she ran down and she showed up at the thing. And the next day she worked.
It was so crazy. The studio didn't
They
even
didn't
know
know.
she was in the
Didn't know she
movie.
was in the
And they
film.
were watching the rushes and they're like, wait, what?
Yeah, they're like, wait, what is Marlene Dietrich doing in this
Yeah.
film? And she also agreed, and she was not the only one that agreed to appear in this film for less than was
Yeah.
asked. She agreed to appear for minimum union wage and not even receive a credit,
Yeah.
which is how much people wanted to work with Orson Welles. There was a similar story about Janet Leigh. He called her agent and asked, could she do this part for such and such amount of money? And it was so low that the agent said, no, and didn't even say anything to her about it. And then Orson called her himself, and she went down to her agent and was infuriated. She said, money is not as important as having the chance to work with Orson Welles.
It's amazing.
So that's the kind of
testament to his talent.
Yeah, his talent, exactly. But they did eventually give Marlene Dietrich a credit, thank goodness, because like I said, you can't take your eyes off of her in this film. Every part she has, which are not a lot, but it just seems like there is so much just in her eyes. You don't even
Yeah.
need her to speak.
I was going to say, too, I don't think she smiles or anything. She
Nope.
has a very stoic, bland face, but it's just her eyes and just her presence.
Yeah, presence. She has a hell of a screen presence. Tanya is kind of this character that we find out that Quinlan is on the wagon. He hasn't drank in like 12 years or something like that. But when he used to get drunk, he would go and hang out at this lady's house and doesn't really say what she is, but you kind of get the sense that maybe she's prostitute. But he asked her to tell the fortune too. So I don't know, maybe she's I think she's supposed to be kind of like a gypsy.
Yeah, I thought she was the kind of madame of this like gypsy house, sort of like a, bohemian type of place. Because, the fortune is actually a very interesting part that I like that she does that. But yeah, it's also never directly said, but it's implied that they used to be lovers at one point. But it's like never, again, it's not.
That's the impression you get. Yeah,
you just get that vibe from them. Interestingly enough, she didn't even recognize him when he first came in, which again is
She's like who are you?
A testament to how just kind of grotesque
he's become over the last 12 years.
She very seriously just cut and dry says, you need to lay off those candy bars. Just straight savage.
And he
to
says,
him.
better than the hooch.
Yeah.
And that voice.
Yeah.
I don't know. He's just, ugh. Yeah, Orson Welles is amazing. Orson Welles and Marlene Dietrich, awesome in this film. So eventually, somehow, and I don't remember exactly how, Vargas comes back to his wife. Mike reunites with Susan, maybe back at the hotel or something, but she kind of tells Mike what happened with Uncle Joe and all this stuff. And then he runs out and he winds up running off and leaving her again alone at the hotel, which apparently has an open window and no shade. And they have this fellow across the way, like shining a flashlight into her room, making her miserable.
Yeah. Just, of course.
Yeah, and it's just like,
And she
what
didn't
is
think,
going on?
She didn't think to go downstairs and say like, hey,
Could I have a room with a shade?
yeah, or can somebody go and like complain? Anything.
She just gets angry, and she reacts so strangely. She just gets angry and turns on the light, starts screaming at the person, and then she throws. What did she throw? She throws something over there at them.
Yeah. What did she throw? I don't know. She threw something, which it did no good, whatever it was.
She threw the light bulb.
Oh, it was a light bulb.
She took the light bulb out. She threw
right.
it, and then Mike comes back from wherever he is and says, "Why is there no light in here?" And she's like, "Because the light bulb's gone." And he's just like, "What?" And so she's saying all these things that are happening, and it's like, why does he keep insisting to run off when clearly somebody's trying to harass her? And he just goes about going on and leaving her. But they decide I guess maybe because of the unsafeness of the hotel, they decide he wants her to check out and go somewhere else. I think he actually said at this point that he wanted her to go back home.
Yeah, he tried.
And she was like, I'm not going back home.
Yeah.
I'm staying with you because, again, she's so weird.
And then the irony is she didn't stay with him. They then separated again.
Well, it wasn't her. That wasn't her fault.
That's true,
she
but
thought
still,
that they were going to be together. Yeah, and then you see another scene, and here's where you can hear some of this Henry Mancini music. You see this kid running around the streets. It's that kid that threw the acid on Vargas, and they said, Uncle Joe wants to talk to you, and he starts running around the streets trying to avoid Uncle Joe. And as he's running around the streets, you do hear this sort of Henry Mancini, very frantic music with a lot of brass, and it sounds very Henry Mancini. So I do think this is part of the score, but it works really well in that particular scene. And then Uncle Joe gets this kid, he's yelling at him not to throw acid on Vargas. He's making too big of a deal. He's going to get everybody in trouble. And then they keep cutting back. Like I said, Susan and Mike are going to the next hotel, and they have this romantic moment, and he pulls the car over and they're kind of making out in the car. And then the cops come out, Quinlan and Pete, and Quinlan and Pete are like, well, we're going to go talk to these people up at the dynamite place or whatever. And so Mike's like, well, I was going to take my wife to the hotel. And they're like, oh, Pete'll drive her. And he's like, oh, okay.
Sure. Like a guy that he just met,
Pete the cop that's
cool.
hanging around with this suspicious other cop. Sure.
What else is funny, too, is like at this point, our two main guys they're butting heads. But he's totally okay with his wife just going with like, this is his rival and this is his rival's partner. And he's just like, take my wife.
Yeah.
What?
Go ahead, take her away. So Pete gets in the car, and obviously Susan's not very happy about this situation. She's not happy about it at all. But Vargas goes off with the other guys, with Quinlan and the other guys, and she goes with Pete. And Pete notices as they're driving along that somebody's following them. And who is it but Uncle Joe? So Pete stops the car, and he's like, what are you doing following us? And so then he sort of apprehends Uncle Joe and puts him in the car, takes Susan to this hotel that's completely abandoned. They have the weirdest hotels in this place.
So weird.
It's an abandoned hotel full of all these little cottages, I guess.
Which, to that point, that was the thing that really like struck me the most of like, what is going on here? He took his wife out of a populated area where there's a large police presence into literally the middle of nowhere on the turf of the people who are after them.
There's not one person at this hotel besides her. It even says in the beginning, nobody else is here. And this is honestly where you get those really beautiful landscape views that I was talking about, those vista views in the black and white that Russell Meddy does so beautifully. And then we get introduced to another character, which I really, this guy's really good. Dennis Weaver. He plays the hotel clerk. Dennis Weaver, actually, he's really well known for his role in Gunsmoke. He was this character named Chester Good. And actually, that's how Orson Welles found him, because he really admired his character in Gunsmoke. And he got a hold of him and asked, hey, would you come do this role? And he basically said, just go around and improvise. How would you play this character? And that's what he did. He did this weird, what would you even say he's doing? He's just this really weird guy.
He's just a really weird guy.
He's really skittish.
I assumed he was somehow supposed to be comic relief, which is really weird because it's completely against the tone of the entire movie. And then he just shows up and you're just kind of like, oh, This guy is interesting.
Wells later described the part as a Shakespearean loony.
Yeah, I could see it because again, it's a very dramatic situation, and he did a very good job.
Yeah,
there was something.
Another
not
thing
there.
they did really well too with him to make him seem even more weird and skittish and anxious is the way they cut him a lot, like the fast cuts
Yeah,
and him
true.
moving all around, and it's really good cinematography and editing on him as well. A little bit about him is that he was a product of the Actors Studio, so method actor. He was a high school athlete. He was sixth in the decathlon in the 1948 Olympic trials.
Wow.
And he was a Navy pilot in World War II and a dedicated environmentalist. He actually had an environmentalist house that was built all of recycled or environmentally friendly materials.
Wow.
Luckily, he didn't die of a fire.
Yeah, no smoking
No.
there. Whew.
So anyhow, she gets checked into this hotel, I guess you could call it, and this Dennis Weaver is bothering her. He's playing the music loud. He's popping in and out of the window. He's hiding all around, and he's just very weird. But she's like, "I'm going to go to sleep. It's all fine. No big deal. Whatever." Again, you're cutting back and forth. Like I said, these scenes all cut right back and forth. This is when Quinlan and Vargas and the DA and Pete and all, well, not Pete yet. Pete's not there yet, but they all go over to interrogate this fellow Sanchez, who they find is a Mexican fellow who is dating Marcia Lineker, which is the daughter of the rich guy. So now Quinlan is certain that this guy is guilty. Oh, this has to be the person that planted the bomb. So they go over to his apartment, and Quinlan really starts giving him the business. And this guy's all upset. He's freaking out. He keeps trying to talk to Vargas in Spanish, and that makes Quinlan even more angry, and etc. Vargas goes into the bathroom to wash his hands for some reason. He was going to use the telephone, but he goes in the bathroom and washes his hands, and he knocks over the shoebox. And he picks it back up. He looks at it. It's empty. He picks it back up and puts it on the shelf, which seems like nothing at the time.
Yeah.
And then in the meantime, they're still investigating. Vargas says, "I'm going to go over across the way and call my wife." And this is another place where there's one of those signs. As soon as he walks in the store, this lady says, "I'm blind." She can't see. She shows him where the telephone was. And as he's talking on the telephone, he calls up Susan. She gets her call through from the hotel. She's wearing a lingerie and her hair down. She looks very pretty. The sign says, "If you are mean enough to steal from the blind, help yourself."
Oh, wow.
And I happened to notice that as he's talking to her, he moves his head in a certain way, and you can see the sign. So he determines that he believes that Susan is okay because, I'm sure that a phone call is enough to check on his wife so he can feel like he can go back to his investigation.
Yeah, just a quick 2-minute call or whatever it was.
Yeah, she's fine. No problem.
Cool.
She's all by herself in this random place with this weird night manager, but it's okay. As he comes back, also Pete shows up with Uncle Joe. And Quinlan's like, "What are you doing here? Why are you here?" And he's like, "Oh, this guy was following us." And then Quinlan starts to interrogate Uncle Joe a little bit. And then Quinlan says, "Oh, well, Pete, go search the bathroom or whatever." And he comes out. He has this dynamite. And he's like, "Oh, this was right here in plain sight." And Sanchez starts freaking out. They're saying that the dynamite is what made the bomb. And so they were looking for 2 missing sticks of dynamite or something. And Sanchez is protesting, saying that I didn't put this here. This wasn't here before. And Vargas says, "Well, where did you find that?" And Quinlan says, "Where'd you find it, Pete?" And he says, "Oh, it was right here in the shoebox." Mm-hmm. And Vargas is like, "What?"
Which, the audience knows, and Vargas knows. It was not
wasn't
in that shoebox.
Not in the shoebox. So then, actually, Vargas accuses Quinlan of planting evidence. Quinlan's like, "I'm not going to be insulted by this, blah, blah, blah." But then the assistant district attorney, the one we said is the good guy, Schwartz, he actually believes Vargas. And Vargas wants to go and look into Quinlan's records to see if they can find this missing dynamite. So they go off to do that. And then Uncle Joe thinks, "Well, this guy Vargas is causing trouble for you, Quinlan. Why don't you come over here and have a drink with me and we'll discuss?" The guy that's on the wagon for 12 years. And what do? Start to drink. Uncle Joe says, "Hey, why don't we get in cahoots? We both don't like this Vargas. Let's get rid of him. I have a plan." And Quinlan's like, "Oh, yeah. He's like acting like he's going along with it. And you think, okay, they have hatched this plan, right? And I thought another thing was when they were walking away to go to the bar, you see Pete in the window and his face just watching them walk away, and he knows that Quinlan is going to drink. It's a really poignant moment, I think, in the film.
It is, because it's very much a explanation of their whole relationship, is that he's blinded by that, sort of like friendship. And it's one of those situations where if you come across somebody you love and they're doing something wrong, you can either support them because you love them, or you can be honest with them because you love them. And it's hard to decide which to do. And in this situation, he's just kind of like, well, he's a grown man. Let him do his own thing.
But it's breaking his heart to see it. Yeah, you can tell by his face. It's a beautiful shot.
And I think that's also what kind of starts getting the gears turning in his head, that he's like a little bit suspicious now. Like, wait a minute. He's been on the wagon for 12 years as far as I know.
And why is he going over with Uncle Joe?
Yeah, why is he doing that?
And he was just accused of this being planted. So the seed is kind of being planted.
Yeah, he's definitely starting to thinking. Was that also when there was the whole scene where he's like, I'm going to quit. Here's my badge. That type of thing.
Not yet.
Spoils.
No. So,
Spoils.
we're getting to that, though. So they go off to the bar, and then to get switched back to the hotel, and you see these thugs all hanging around. You see this poncho guy. You see him throughout the film. And he has a whole slew of thugs now, and they're throwing this wild party, and they're annoying the poor Dennis Weaver, the clerk, and he's freaking out, whatever. And they're really upsetting Susan because she's trying to sleep. She's like, this is so much noise. Can we turn this all down? And every time the phone is answered, it's Poncho talking to her. He's like, oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Vargas, like in this horrible way. And somebody starts whispering through the walls saying, watch out, they have drugs. Do you know what these drugs are? And she's, instead of maybe leaving and running away, doing something, I don't know, there's nowhere to run to, I suppose. She just keeps sitting there in the room like, oh, okay, well, I don't know why this person's whispering to me. But then it's going to cut back to Schwartz and Vargas have found out some information about Quinlan, and they presented to the DA Adair saying, look, we found he had purchased the same dynamite. 2 pieces are missing from his ranch. It looked really suspicious. And then it cuts to the scene, which I think this is a really important scene as well. Pete and Quinlan. Pete goes into the bar, finds Quinlan by himself drunk. He's trying to give him coffee because he knows they have to go meet with the district attorney to try to find out what's going on here with this dynamite situation. And in this scene, I think it's very important. Quinlan is talking about the best way to murder someone. And then he's talking about his wife being murdered by a Mexican. And I wonder, though, was she murdered by a Mexican?
That's an interesting point because...
Or is he just trying to frame the Mexicans?
Yeah.
Because this was probably back when he was drinking. He said the best and cleanest way to kill somebody is to strangle them. Then it comes out that his wife was strangled.
Yeah.
She was strangled by a Mexican, and he never got his hands on him.
And it's a very interesting thought because it skews his whole sense of justice. That's what everybody thinks for the last few decades.
Why he hates Mexicans.
Yeah, that's why he's been so firm, and he's the go-getter, and he's our boy to kind of avenge his wife.
Yeah.
But what if he's the reason that she was killed?
Yeah, I almost wonder, did he murder her himself?
Yeah, that's a
in
really
some
interesting
drunken
thought.
state.
Drunken rage, yeah.
Yep. Anyhow, that was a thought I was thinking at the time, but it's a really important scene because he's telling Pete this stuff. And I guess we should have mentioned earlier, another reason why Pete loves Quinlan so much is that apparently Quinlan took a bullet for him. That's why he has what they call a game leg, which I guess is a prosthetic leg.
Yeah.
And that's why he walks with a cane. The cane is very important to mention as well. The cane comes into play later on.
Right.
So he's always walking with this cane because he has this game leg, because he took a bullet for Pete that was meant for Pete. And that's another reason why I think Pete owes him all this, feels like he owes him everything. So he gets Quinlan some coffee, and Quinlan takes him to the DA. They all confront him. And then that's when Quinlan throws his badge down, threatens to quit, walks out. And then the DA gets upset, Adair, and he starts saying, oh, no, we didn't mean anything by it, and telling Vargas to apologize to him. And Vargas is like, no, not apologizing. And then that's when Quinlan, after Vargas leaves, because Vargas is going to go try to get more information. He's going to go look up all of Quinlan's case files and see if he can find more framing type things. And as he leaves, that's when Quinlan talks to the DA and Pete and says, I've heard that this Vargas and his wife are drug addicts. So he's planting the seed about the drug addicts. And then we go back to Vargas is looking up Quinlan's cases. And then we go back to Susan, who now all these thugs are coming into her room. They're going to attack her. And specifically, there's one that says, I like to watch. This front one, this girl that we haven't been introduced to before. She doesn't really have a name, I don't think. She's like one of the gang. But she says, I like to watch when they come in the room. And her name was Mercedes McCambridge. She was a Orson Welles Mercury Theater person as well. And this was another thing. When Orson Welles was filming, he went to lunch with her and said, hey, after lunch, why don't you come play this one role. She just walked over and played
I'm
this
free this
one
evening,
part.
sure.
Yeah, so she just went over and filmed this part. But she won a Best Supporting Actress Academy Award for All the King's Men. And she was also the voiceover for the demon in The Exorcist.
Oh, wow.
So when the little girl talks in the demon
Yeah,
voice, that's her voice. And what I thought was really sad is she had one son who wound up killing his wife and 2 children and himself because he was fired from his job and he was accused of embezzling funds from her accounts.
Oh my gosh, wow.
So I thought that was an interesting thing. But anyhow, she has that very small role. But they grab her, they overwhelm Susan. We really don't know Susan's fate at that point. We think she's going to be injected with drugs. That's what we're led to believe. And then the next thing is Pete's looking for Quinlan. He can't find him after he storms out and does all this stuff. He calls Tanya. She says he's not here. This is another scene we have with Marlene Dietrich. But you get the impression that Pete isn't sure. Pete is starting to be less and less sure because he goes and finds Vargas when Vargas is looking up all the case files. And he says, "What are you doing here?" When Vargas starts showing him, look at this one. Look at this one. Didn't any of these...
Weren't suspicious to anybody. It wasn't coincidental that this, and this all seemed a little...
Yeah. Didn't you think something fishy was going on here? And then you can just see Pete. This is why I think that Joseph Kalela, or whatever his name was, that's why I think he did a really good job. He did a really good job of conveying all these emotional expressions without making a lot of expression. You could just see him starting to doubt. At this point, finally... Mike thinks maybe I should go see my wife.
He's like, oh, yeah, I'm
After
married.
all this, he decides to go look for her. Well, guess what? Vanished. Nobody's there but our friend Dennis Weaver. And suddenly he's like, oh, nobody was here. How could Vargas even believe that when he called the hotel and spoke with her?
Yeah.
So I don't know why he's even confused by that. But he's looking for everything. He finds that his gun has been stolen from his briefcase. And he doesn't know what's going on. He's freaking out. All of a sudden, now he's worried. And then the next thing you cut to is this scene, which the cinematography in the scene is really, really great. You see Susan on the bed, and you can tell she's in some sort of a delirium. She's out of it. Uncle Joe's there, and Quinlan's there. And Uncle Joe, they're talking or whatever, and Quinlan calls the Vice Squad and says, please come, this person's on drugs, and something else may have happened. And then Uncle Joe starts to think, uh-oh, I might be in trouble here. And Quinlan starts advancing on him. He's trying to escape. He breaks the window. He's trying to get out. And this is all done in a really beautiful way with the cinematography, where they have this sort of light going off and on, dark and light. It's like a light turning off and on. So you're just seeing these little flashes of what's going on. So it makes it, and it's also cutting to Susan on the bed, going back and forth, and it's cutting to each of their faces. And it's very dark. So it's really hard to really see exactly what's going on, but you see enough to sense all the terror and the fear. And then what winds up happening is that Quinlan strangles Uncle Joe with some sort of a cloth or something. A scarf, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I think it was a
Yeah,
scarf.
and he strangles him and just leaves him there over the bed. And here is the last sign, a really important sign on this one too. And they hold on the sign for a minute, because as he's walking out, you see Quinlan, the guy's dead, Susan's there on the bed. He opens the door. He's looking in. He walks out, and they shut the door, and they put the camera on the sign, and the sign says, "Stop. Are you forgetting something?"
Ah, and of course he does.
Well, at first, it's like, okay, well, yeah, that's what room signs say. Why are
Yeah.
they focusing on this? And then the next thing that happens is that Susan wakes up, and she sees a dead man. So she
Yeah.
starts freaking out. She runs out to the fire escape. No reason to run out the door. The best thing to do is to run to the fire
Yeah, you
escape
should.
where you're
Yeah.
trapped. And she's also naked.
Also, yeah, I was going to say also, like, yeah, it definitely.
So she just has a sheet over her, and she's screaming out the fire escape, and all these people at the bottom are just laughing at her. They're like, and what's really funny, well, not funny, but what's really ironic is that Mike drives right through all these people, and he has to stop because they're in the way, and he's like, get out of the way. She's screaming, Mike, 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 so intent on trying to get where he goes to, doesn't even notice his wife,
Nope.
which I think is sort of a statement for the way he treats her the entire film.
Yeah.
He just is too busy to pay attention to what's going on.
Yeah.
Because he's going to the strip club to go beat up these little gang members and, where's my wife? And he's grabbing them and choking them and stuff like that. Meanwhile, he just drove right by her. That gets him nowhere. They tell him she's at Rancho such and such, whatever. And he runs out, but then he gets found by the assistant district attorney, Schwartz, and he says, hey, you got to know, they found Susan. She had drugs all around her. The Vice Squad picked her up. They put her in jail. There's also Uncle Joe was dead by her and stuff like that. And so Mike's beside himself for that. And he goes to the jail and she's like, Mike, take me home. And he's just like, yeah, okay, gotta go. It's like, all right, I gotta go
So I
now,
have to
Susan.
finish
Like, I don't
something.
have time for this here. I gotta go see what's
Yeah.
going on, because Pete has come to the jail. And what does Pete say? He takes Vargas in the back room and he says, I have something to show you. And Vargas is like, I don't have time for this. What is this? And he says, this was found in the room with Uncle Joe, and it's Quinlan's cane. And that's why that sign, are you forgetting
Yeah.
something, is so important. And at this point now, Pete has realized Quinlan is a corrupt cop.
Yeah.
But he's still having to turn him in. You can tell is weighing on him. And then he agrees to wear a wire to get recorded to try to get Quinlan admitting all this stuff. But Quinlan is at Tanya's. He's still pretty drunk. He's at Tanya's. And we are going to stop there.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to give away the rest of the ending.
The climactic ending, no.
Yeah, it's a very dramatic ending.
It
yes.
is, yeah.
And it's a very poignant ending, too. And I think there's a lot of symbolism in the way it ends.
There is, and yeah, and it's also with both characters, both leads, you kind of sympathize with both of them. You might agree with them to an extent, you might disagree with them to an extent. It's kind of, ambiguous that way as well. Makes you think.
Yeah, so the last thing I want to mention is that, like I said, the budget with this film was $825,000 budget, and Orson Welles did it within $900,000. And they asked for a 38-day shooting schedule, and it was completed in 39 days.
It's just wild.
Yeah.
To think about.
So, I mean, what problem wasn't in production with Orson?
No.
It was him just... But anyhow, so on Silver Screen Time Machine, we have to do our star ratings. And since you're the guest, you get to go first.
So I think that I would give this a...
It's a 1 to 5,
1 to
sorry,
5,
I should say.
I'll give this a 4. I think it's great as a B movie. I think that it is such a good B movie that most people don't know it actually is a B movie. However, we talked about miscasting.
Yeah.
We talked about the wife character just really
Weird,
being kind of goofy. For those reasons, I can't say, it's a 5 out of 5, but it's definitely worth watching, especially if you're into anything Orson Welles. And if you like film noir, this is very much film noir. So yeah, my rating is a 4-star.
My rating is also a 4. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous cinematography throughout. The things that Russell Meddy did with this film 100% deserved to be nominated for an Oscar. Obviously he couldn't because of the situation, the way the film was released and what happened with the film, but would have deserved an Oscar nomination for this. It is amazingly shot. I can't explain enough about how much I love the cinematography in this
amazing.
film. But cinematography is always great in all Orson Welles films, but he just really does a nice job. The score, what there is of the score, beautiful. Henry Mancini always knows how to strike the right note. He was just a master at that. Loved Marlene Dietrich, loved Orson Welles, loved Joseph Kalela, or whatever his name is, and the other characters, Ray Collins, all the other characters, really good. Again, yeah, I can't deal with Charlton Heston in this role.
And I think they're like, let's give him a mustache and see if that's okay.
Let's put some dark makeup on his face. Give him a black mustache.
He kind of self-tanned, and they just thought...
it's so bad.
And it's just, oh, no.
Yes, Charlton Heston in brown face.
Yeah, essentially.
Not good.
And no.
And again, Janet Leigh, just not for her. The not type of role for her. I don't even know. Her character is bizarre, not even developed.
Funny, when I first saw the movie, I didn't even know it was her.
Yeah.
I didn't recognize her.
I mean, she looks very beautiful in the film.
Yeah, I mean, and
I think had she had an actual reasonable role to play, she may have done well. I think she suffers from this role just not being very fleshed out and not making a lot of sense.
And that might be Orson Welles had trouble adapting female characters a lot.
Possibly,
So maybe that was part of it, but I don't know. She was there and she looked good, and that was about it.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I think that this is... Now I'm happy that it's a well-known movie, with the edits made in the 90s. I'm glad that we kind of get to see the vision that Welles wanted.
Yeah.
And if you're a fan of his, and like we said, just great cinematography in general, it's definitely worth the watch.
Yeah, this isn't an Orson Welles type film.
Absolutely.
You have your Orson Welles trademarks in this film. So, and again, a great performance by Orson Welles. So
Yeah.
it is well worth seeing. This is a great film. It's very suspenseful. It's very interesting. I don't think you're going to be necessarily bored. You might find the characters annoying and somewhat unlikable, but it's not a boring film. It's very fast-paced. It's very interesting. I definitely think worth a watch. So please check it out. And thank you so much for being our guest, Ed.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It was nice talking to you, and we'll catch you next time. So this is Wendy from Silver Screen Time Machine, Wendy's Classic Film Review, saying goodbye. Thank you for listening to our podcast today. Please don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. And please leave us a comment or a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Intro and outro music composed by Heidi Engel. Artwork by Tyler Birch. Produced and edited by Wendy Whittick. Recorded at PCTV Studios, Pittsburgh, PA. See you next time.